And it depends on the scenario. So the scenario we were evaluating was assuming that you had a well pad where there are new wells, Bakken wells that you wanted to bring online, but there was insufficient gas takeaway capacity. So it was proactively establishing a storage site, knowing that you were going to be producing this gas and needing to store it in the subsurface. So that was the scenario we were evaluating. Gas recovery factors, based again on simulation, ranged from 47 to 63% in the most what I call viable scenarios. We had some scenarios where if we didn't constrain water production, if you're trying to just produce it back too fast, the gas too fast, you could reach water production rates of like 10,000 barrels a day, which we thought was too high. So in many cases, we constrained the water production. So in general, the water production rates that we considered and what we were calling the more viable scenarios range from about 500 to 2,900 barrels a day. So again, with this assumption that you're using this to bring new Bakken wells online and be able to produce that oil, which you wouldn't have been producing, we did a sort of a back-of-the-envelope economic analysis, and our findings suggested that at $40 a barrel oil, from bringing one well on or doing this approach to bring one well on, the economic benefit could be as high as 41 million over a 2-year period, or 200 million for a 5-well pad. So, and again, there's a lot of assumptions that go into that. It was a really basic initial economic assessment. And then we looked at the estimated capital then for the surface facility costs, to do your gas injection, capital costs, maintenance, so forth. And we figured that to be able to inject the gas from those 5 wells, on average, what we anticipated those wells producing with respect to gas, if you were injecting at a rate that averaged about 10 million scuff a day, that it would cost $15.7 million, which is about $2.15 per MCF of gas, just to put it in perspective. And then operational costs were estimated to add another 1 to 3 million per year. We also looked at a scenario where, let's say you want to bring wells online in sequence over, say, a 6-year period. And so we looked at, what if you have this initial storage site and then you have cycles of gas injection and recovery. And that's where we achieved the highest recovery factor, because during that initial gas injection, you're creating that gas bubble. And so you have that interface between your gas and your water, and you lose a lot of that gas. That's a lot of the unrecoverable gas. So once that's established, if you remove that gas and then go back in and use that same storage location repetitively, you get incremental gains in your recovery efficiency. So in this case, we looked at a scenario where we were injecting at 10 million scuff per day for 2-year periods, followed by a 2-year extraction period, and then another injection period for 2 years extraction, and then a third cycle. And in those cases, by the third scenario, and I guess I don't have a pointer, but by the third scenario, we were up to an estimated recovery factor of about 0.63% or 63%. As opposed to that first gas cycle, the estimated recovery factor was just above 50%. So you do get significant improvement with this type of approach. So at that time, we had identified some potential regulatory related challenges or areas where we felt like additional clarity was needed. So for this gas storage approach, one of the key knowns was how you would handle the pore space and the amalgamation of that pore space if multiple landowners were involved. Also, regulatory clarity with respect to compensation for that pore space, which, if any of you have been following some of the recent legislative bills, continues to be controversial. And then also some consideration given to the sale. So if a producer, if they have capacity to a site, they're required to provide a certain volume of gas to that midstream service provider. So you have to think about your timing and in your contracts that you already have established with those midstream service providers. And if you're bringing new gas online, maybe they can't take it right away, but at some point in the near future, they might be able to take it. So you have to figure, factor in, does it make sense to build the storage facility at that time? We also did just a very broad look at other potential targets. So again, there's many conventional oil fields in the state, as well as unconventional oil fields. And so we had just kind of looked at the pros and cons of these different types of storage scenarios. The one consideration with EOR is that, we are finding, again, through a lot of the pilot tests we've done, that it really helps if you have sufficient volumes of gas for that EOR operation. So again, by accumulating and storing this gas, that may provide operators with an opportunity to have larger volumes of gas available for EOR, and that's true for conventional or unconventional. And then some of this is there was a regulatory framework in place already for gas injection into some of the conventional reservoirs. That has been done in the past. And there was also a regulatory framework established for gas injection into Bakken DSUs as long as it's contained within a single DSU. So during the last legislative session, the 2019 legislative session, as a result of some of these findings, it was House Bill 1014 basically allocated $6 million to the EERC for partnerships with industry to evaluate various produced gas storage concepts with the ultimate goal of implementing up to 3 pilot projects. And so really the goal was to better evaluate the key technical, economic, and regulatory considerations associated with gas storage and just better determine, is this technically and economically viable? So again, our goal was to up to 3 pilot projects. So we're targeting, we'd like to have one where we're doing gas storage in a saline target, in a conventional oil field, and then also in the Bakken for EOR. We don't have all of those quite there yet, but I'll explain some of the work that we've done so far. So one of our first partners that approached us was XTO Energy, and so in 2019, we partnered with them on doing an evaluation of two concepts. One was produced gas storage into the Broom Creek, and the other was produced gas EOR in the Bakken. And so we worked with them extensively for several months. We met with various regulatory or state agencies to better define some of those components, and really got almost all of the legwork done. And then unfortunately, it was the start of the oil price decline and COVID, and they said, we're putting these projects on hold indefinitely. However, we did do a lot of the modeling and simulation to evaluate the concept, so I can share some of those results with you here. And this is just an illustration of a predicted plume extent for the location that they were looking at. So in XTO's case, for the Broom Creek storage, they had a well pad with 8 wells that had been drilled but not completed, and they had no gas takeaway capacity. And so they were looking to inject the gas from those wells into the Broom Creek for temporary storage. And so the estimated volumes of gas that we would need to inject to accommodate those wells coming online was 16 million scuff per day. And so this is a scenario that shows just what that injection plume, the estimated injection plume after 1 year of injection, so that's the orange line, that's the closest one around the center dot there, and then what that would look like after 5 years, 5 years following injection, and then following 10 years of injection. So those are the next two, the lighter brown and then the darker brown. So that's the estimated plume extent. Again, there's no structure at this site, so it gives you a sense of how much you might expect that gas to migrate. And then the other zones, the assumption at the time was that you would need a half-a-mile buffer from your plume extent, and that would constitute your storage facility. there's been some changes to the language in Senate Bill 2065 that makes that more of a gray area now in terms of what your actual plume extent would need to be. So, oh, I was like, wait a minute, I thought I already did that, wrong button. Okay, here's just an illustration of the geologic model that was developed for Broom Creek. So the approximate extent was about 6 by 7 miles, and you can see the lighter yellow color there, that's the sandstone, so that was the primary target for injection. And then you have a nice shale seal on top of that that ensures that your gas isn't going to escape out of the formation. So we looked at a variety of different scenarios, produced gas injection rates ranging from 8 to 16 million scuff a day. We injection durations of 1, 2, and 5 years, storage durations of 1, 2, 5, and 10 years. And the results of this work were similar to the initial assessment, where our estimated recovery factors range from about 43 to 63%. And this just shows, this illustrates what that recovery looks like. So we found the best recovery happened after injecting larger amounts of gas, storing it for shorter periods of time, and then recovering it almost right away, which you can imagine, because that gives your gas less time to migrate out. So we achieved the highest estimated recovery when we had, again, the shorter duration gas storage at the higher rate of 16 MCF a day, or million scuff per day, and that was at about 63% recovery. But this chart just shows, and again, I don't have the pointer, so this shows what the projected recovery factors were following gas injection for 1, 2, and 5 year durations at a rate of 16 million scuff per day. And so I don't show the injection periods on this. This is just the recovery. So we're recovering at, in this case, in all cases, after storing that gas for 5 years. And so you can see that blue line, like as a point of comparison, if you look at a recovery factor of 50%, we're achieving that 50% much quicker after only one, for the 1 year injection period versus the 2 year versus the 5 year. It's taking longer and longer to get to that 50% recovery factor. With respect to the surface facility findings, and I talked about this a little bit, again, those larger compressors capable of dealing with the pressures needed for this large volume gas extraction are not readily available. So we looked at using smaller, more modular systems that could then be basically put in parallel to achieve the same results. But it also gives you better flexibility because, as you imagine, when you initially bring these wells online, you're going to have very high gas production rates, and then after time, those are going to decline. So it also gives you the flexibility of being able to remove some of those compressors as your compression needs decline. So when we had looked, we didn't do a full economics on this. Actually, XTO had done a full economic analysis. I can't share those results with you, but I will say ultimately at the end of the day, their results were positive. It indicated a positive economic benefit to implement this. But for example, for the compressors, we looked at if you were to buy like those individual modular skids for the capital costs and installation, it was about $5.2 million for those. The other thing, so the other project we did for XTO was to look at using produced gas for enhanced oil recovery in the Basin. And we simulated a huff and puff type scenario. And we found that using higher rates of injection, in this case, you know, we kind of found that 17 million scuff a day at a single DSU, this was a single DSU, is really where you could get that optimal incremental oil recovery. So the blue line on this, those are the approximate injection rates that XTO was looking at, so significantly lower. We still saw some positive economic benefit. The main well, the blue line, that's the huff and puff well, that's your main injector. And then there were offset wells. And we found that especially if if the offset wells had a high stimulated reservoir volume that was close to the huff and puff well, we saw significant benefit to those offset wells as well. So in this case, though, you can see based on the curves that they continue to increase up to about that 17 million scuff per day mark, and then they sort of level off. So again, I think this helps illustrate the point that we found from some of our other work, that really not to do it right, but to really optimize that incremental oil recovery in the Bakken, it looks like you're going to have to inject it at higher rates. Anything else there? So yeah. So the recent bill, and I'm not going to get into all the details of this because there's a whole lot of nuances, but there is Senate Bill 2065 during this last legislative session that really helped provide some regulatory clarity with respect to poor owner compensation, the amount of poor owners that would have to agree to a project like this in order to achieve the permit for that. And so for gas storage in an oil or gas reservoir, now this excludes anything dealing with EOR, but just for gas storage, you would need 55% of the pore space owners as well as 55% of the mineral owners in agreement. For gas storage in saline reservoirs, you would need 60% of the pore space owners. And then I included natural gas liquid storage in this just because that was also included in the bill, and even though this presentation doesn't focus on the work that we did in that space, I thought some of you might be interested, and certainly a salt cavern could be a viable storage spot for produced gas and not just the natural gas liquids. But in that case, it was 60% of the pore space owners and 55% of the salt mineral owners, the cavern's salt mineral owners. The other key area where we got some legislative clarity was the timing of royalty payments. And it basically said, okay, if that gas, if you're taking it from a DSU and injecting it in the subsurface, and it hasn't gone through any point of sale yet, then royalties are not due until after that gas is injected and stored and recovered and goes through that point of sale. That's the time in which you would pay royalties. So again, it just helped better define some of these gray areas with respect to the regulatory rules surrounding this. So that was helpful. Okay, so where we're at, we are currently partnering with Marathon Oil and then two smaller private equity-backed companies on the evaluation of various gas storage injection scenarios. We are, the ultimate goal is to get out there in the field and demonstrate this through actual pilot projects. We are willing to discuss if there are any industry folks out there that are looking at this. You know, we are willing to discuss potential additional collaborations, so please talk to me. And then really, ultimately, this will help us all build our knowledge about, you know, is this technically viable? Is it economically viable? Where is this best applied in the state? And so at the end of the day, we will have all of those findings available for the public and the state and industry. And with that, I don't know, Ed, if I have time. Maybe I'm over. I don't know if there's time for questions, but.
There are time for questions. We've got a microphone or bell.
In your modeling, did you consider secondary porosity permeability effects in a fracture network?
In the Bakken modeling, yes. We used a EDFM. It's a discrete fracture modeling network. And I am not a modeler or simulation person, but I know it's a newer way to deal with the very complicated fracture networks in the Bakken and secondary porosity as well. We do not do that in the Broom Creek, but we certainly did in the Bakken.
So
Yes.
in your Middle-East reservoir study, you talk about the production of the water. Do you also look at how you're going to dispose of that water?
We looked at that in the cost. Yep, just what those water disposal costs, because obviously that's going to be a key factor. And so, you know, early on in that recovery curve, obviously you're recovering more gas than water, and then you reach a point where you're recovering less and less gas and more water. So we knew that was going to be a key consideration. And so again, we tried to constrain some of those water production rates to what we thought would be more viable. But when we looked at the cost, we did include the cost of disposal in that.
Did that include a second well back into the basin?
Boy, Mark, it's been a long time since we did it. I can't remember if we assumed it would go to a local saltwater disposal well. I think that was the assumption.
Please, when you talked about injecting CO2 in saline formations, you talked about Broom Creek. But is DRC also working on injecting in like Deepwood formation, as it's like deeper, and even if you have some problems of sealing, like it's deeper formation. So are you working in CO2 storage in Deepwood or only shallow formation?
No, we are looking at multiple potential targets throughout the whole stratigraphic interval of the Williston Basin. So yes, not for this project, this is really driven by what our partners are looking at. But for other projects, yes, we've looked at the deadwood and collected core from the deadwood and some of the deeper formations.
The second question, please. When you inject in like some saline formations, you have from the geochemistry perspective, you have some interactions between the oil, between the CO2, sorry, and the brine. And this reduction in acidity, like it will reduce, it will causes some dissolution and precipitation of such minerals. And this can cause some instabilities and some rock weakening, especially if there is the presence of fault. Did you consider this perspective or not?
Not in this, because we were only looking at produced gas, not CO2. But certainly in our efforts where we're looking at CO2, we look at some of those CO2 rock interactions. And you're right, you can have carbonic acid forming, and that's definitely something that we look at.
Just last one, please.
Okay.
Regarding the injection rate in the Huffing Pump, when the slope became like stable, constant, is it because you reached the minimum miscibility pressure of the gas that you injected, or?
I would have thought we would be at above minimum miscibility pressure from the beginning. I mean, at that depth, I'm trying to think of what the reservoir pressure was. I believe we were already at minimum miscibility
Because
pressure.
I think that like once we increase the injection pressure or the injection rate, like the recovery factor is increasing. And then what I wanted to know is when we inject more than the minimum miscibility pressure, is it like more profitable, or like the recovery factor will be like the same? That's why the slope becomes constant.
So not related to that, we believe that that was more the fact that you're finally getting to the point where you're able, so possibly yes, because you're also able to effectively increase your reservoir pressure to a significant amount. So that does account for it. It's also, I think, you're accessing more of the reservoir, those, not just the fracture networks, but I think at that point, when you have enough gas in there, you're also able to permeate the matrix. Now, related to your other question, a lot of the work we've done through minimum miscibility pressure testing and sort of like a PVT cell has shown that it's not a set line in the sand with MMP. The higher above MMP you can be in many cases, the more of the heavier end hydrocarbons you're going to recover. So we recommend if you can get above MMP, in some of these, especially reservoirs that happen to have a higher proportion of heavier hydrocarbons, it's better to be above MMP. But we found it's not just a line in the sand where boom, you hit MMP and everything miscibilizes into your oil, into your CO2. It's not such a set line in the sand. But yes, you're welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Afternoon, my name is Joe Aducci. I'm a geologist with Neset Consulting, and it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Travis Stolldorf. Travis is a subsurface geologist with the North Dakota Department of Mineral Resources Geological Survey, and the title of his talk is Drill Stem Test Results and Production Mapping, Aids in Assessing and Prospecting the Williston Basin of North Dakota. Travis.
Good afternoon, everybody. Again, my name's Travis Stolldorf. I work with Geological Survey. I have a background in oil and gas and came up here 4 years ago, I guess, almost now. So it's Bismarck's home. But I'll talk to you about a project I've recently worked on. It's not a terribly technical presentation, but I hope it'll show you what data is available, how to get it, and hopefully it's very valuable. So I'll go over a little bit about why we did the project, what were the hurdles, and some of the challenges that operators were facing getting DST data. Go briefly touch on some illustrations of the methodology that was used. And then I'll show you what's the data sets that are available. There was 14 intervals that we covered, hydrocarbon producing intervals, and I'll show you where to get all that stuff. So first of all, we'll just do the basics. Drill stem tests were very common. They're less common these days, but from the 50s on, they were a very common way of assessing all kinds of things, including flow rate, porosity or permeability, and some of those things have been debated about how well they can be used, but they do contain a lot of valuable data. And the way they work, it's just a temporary completion of a wellbore. They set the packers above and below the target interval, and then they allow the formation to flow up into the drill pipe, and that can last for a few minutes or it can last several days, depending on the objectives of the person running the test. So that is why some of the results can be a little debatable as far as flow rates and things like that. One of the biggest issues, no matter where you work, is being able to find the data and being able to get that data into something you use, whether that's a software like Petrel or Kingdom or any of those. And you usually have several databases. Maybe you're running to a government website, the USGS, or even better, the NDGS website to grab your data. You have a corporate database that is usually not well looked after. And then you have different subscription databases like IHS, Drilling Info, but all of them, it's just hard to find one. You want to look at, I want to see drill stem tests from the Madison. Well, I don't want to spend 2.5 weeks looking for that stuff. So hopefully this has consolidated those results, and it'll be a lot easier in those senses. One of the uses though for DSTs is they can be very instrumental in assessing fields or prospecting. And because they are less used now, it's important to consolidate this thing because exploration and assessment will continue on in this basin long after I'm gone. And so one clear example is it's just a matter of getting more complete data and getting a more accurate model, more accurately defining your play. And this could be on a field scale or a basin scale, but the more data you can provide that shows you, it might not be producing from this interval, but there was definitely measurable hydrocarbons in there. Maybe they chose not to complete that interval because the one below it or above it was significantly better. There's all sorts of reasons, but you can actually, by going beyond just production, you can start to better assess how big the play might be, and it gives you a more accurate map. So this is a little bit about the methodology. The first thing I did, I think the first DST in North Dakota was in 1953, and since then they've ran about 20,000 different tests or different intervals, and so there was a lot of failed, just bad data. So that was the first thing to do, was get rid of any of the data that would corrupt results. The second problem was about a little over half of the DST results didn't have a formation or interval associated with it. It would say unknown, or in the case of the Madison, the Madison can mean a lot of different things. Are you talking about the Charles? Are you talking about the Lodgepole? Anything in between? So that was a big part. We broke the Madison up into 3 different intervals, and then we also, anything that was unknown, we found a home for it. And essentially just using the top and base depths, we were able to use a lot of filters within Petra and Excel and get to where we could see that this test was occurring. So hopefully the accuracy of everything is very improved too. For the ease of people using this stuff, I just went through and ranked, because it's kind of a general, this is supposed to be a general tool for exploration or assessment. There's no deep dives into the flow charts or any of that, just because of the scope of the project. But the ranked results were based on the comments section. And so different comments meant different things. If there was oil recovered in the pipe or in the sampler, that was considered a strong hydrocarbon signal, and it was given a DST-A. So the DST-B is the same, it gives you a hydrocarbon signal, but it wasn't as strong. So in the case of a DST-A, the strongest hydrocarbon signal, you actually see either oil or gas as the primary component of the fluid, or it was actually measured in the drill pipe or in the sampler. In the case of the DST-B, it's weaker. It would be like oil cut water, or gas cut drilling mud, or something like that. There is a hydrocarbon signal there, but it is just not quite as strong as the other one. The last was just nothing. No hydrocarbons present. So there weren't. It's a negative DST. It's another data point to say this interval didn't work right here. And so after they were ranked, they got consolidated for a lot of reasons. But the way this is ranked, so you can take this as a grain of salt, and I wanted to show you guys this so you could see this, because each interval, they were consolidated, and the highest or the most positive rank, however you'd like to see or say that, is the one that interval gets for the given well. So if it was a Bakken and it had a Bakken DSTs, they took 3 of them in there, and they have just like an A, a B, and a negative, it would still get the A, because at least part of that interval had some oil in the drill pipe. Now, when they went a little lower, hypothetically, it got worse and worse, but that's how these are supposed to be ranked. So that doesn't mean it's the only DST in that interval. It just meant that this interval there was a hydrocarbon signal in the interval. And most of it comes in the Madison. We split it into 3 groups. You could probably split it into a dozen if you wanted to. So a lot of that highest ranking stuff happens in the Madison. And so we did this for 14 different intervals, everything from the Deadwood up through the Ordovician Silurian into the Devonian. And there is tons of data all the way up into the Spearfish, which is our shallowest play in the Triassic. And this just gives you an idea of the different resources that are out there. We have mostly oil, a little oil and gas, and even a little nitrogen. The way to access this, and this is probably, if you get anything from this talk, I'd like you to get this part. This is where you can find this stuff. There's a lot of information on our website. Not all the time. It is easy to get to. But if you use this, you'll go right to it. If not, you can just Google NDGS publications, and you will find eventually. And then you can download, I'll give you an idea of what's available with these. So there's a place under our website that's called publications. These are all called geologic investigations. So if you're looking for numbers, they're GI 230 through 241, and it covers, again, all of these will come, drill stem tests for all 14 of these intervals. Each one will have a brief summary about the project. There's not a whole lot about stratigraphy or anything, just a brief summary, but type log and our strat column is there, just so you can have an idea of where this is. And a lot of this, again, I'll say it again, it's a lot about exploration. So if you're familiar with all these things, you can skip some of it, obviously. Again, this is the Ratcliffe interval, which is the uppermost interval in the Madison that we looked at. So you'll see each of these GIs, I'm sorry on the pointer, but that the little in the corner upper left where it says GI 231, that's what it looks like on the website. So I'm kind of trying to go through every little thing you can get. So the DST map is one of them. You have production maps. The production was updated in the third quarter of 2019. So it's a little out of date, and this stuff won't be updated regularly, but it gives someone an idea if they're coming into the basin for the first time and looking for a formation, want to know where these wells are. Sometimes getting the data, again, is hard. And so there's multiple production pools that the Industrial Commission uses. And it's kind of generationally, as a play evolves, it might be, it gets named this pool, and then over here it's named this pool. So this gives you an idea of where, if you're looking for where that production is and you don't know what the name it's under, it gives you a list of that as well. CUMOIL maps, again, these are exploration tools. Where's this place? Where's the Madison? Where's the Frobisher Elida? Where's that the most productive? And again, they're not updated, so they can be. The Bakken is the one I've made for the Bakken is already outdated. The ones for the less produced plays in the recent memory stay pretty well as far as finding out where the places of higher production are. All the well lists, everything's available on an Excel spreadsheet. Gives you the rank of the DST, whether it was oil or gas. It also gives you the production pool, and we're trying to make things more easily available, easily downloaded, not just a PDF. One thing that I also came across as I was doing this was I noticed a lot of talk in the comments about either H2S or sour gas or black water or things like that. So as a add-on to this, I went back through and just quickly ranked all the wells that had, or all the drill stem tests that had a mention of hydrogen sulfide and in the comments. And so there's 8 producing intervals. You can obviously guess where they are in the carbonates. But these are, so this is more of just a general safety thing. If people that are coming in that might not know that there are places where H2S for pipeline things. So it's a first pass type of thing, but it's separated into true groups, and it was just based on burbage. And where you expect H2S likely to encounter are places where they either said, yeah, we had H2S in this, or we had sour gas, or something like that, acid gas. The lesser or the weaker one is possible, and it was just like something similar to saying black water, or just not quite a confirmation of definitely H2S. They thought it was something, but they weren't apparently confident enough to write it down. And so I will wrap it up and just let you know that all this stuff is available online, the NDGS website. There's a lot of things available through the NDIC website. You are more than welcome to call and ask me questions if you can't find things. If you're looking for certain maps or shape files, may not be the one that gets you those things, but I should know where to go. Thank you guys for listening.
Yep, there we go. So one thing I should add to Travis is the reason that he got started on this is the U.S. Geological Survey is doing an assessment, another assessment of the Williston Basin, hydrocarbon assessment. And so we did this, the driving force behind this was to get the data readily available to them, to hopefully help push that assessment up. The conventional assessment is done. We don't know when it'll be released. Any day now is certainly possible. The unconventional will probably be released by the end of this year. That's when it's due. So one thing I found out, this is a virtual conference. You know, thank God most people are here, but we still have 150 or so people that are on virtually. And so when we ask questions, we need to use the microphone. That's my fault. So any questions for Travis?
Have you captured any of the water analysis, particularly RW values or anything like that that might be associated with these tests?
No, they would be extremely valuable. So the information that I had was very basic in that it had usually a formation top, the API number, top and depth, but I didn't have like what an operator would see from a drill stem test. Very rarely do I have that. I usually have what they submit, you know, and it might just be comments, top and base, whatever they, you know, the bare minimum, you know, whatever the requirement is. So no, we don't get a lot of that. It's there, but it's hard to, it's in a PDF, in a well file, and they're all individual, so it's really hard to extract extract big data sets out of that.
I guess to follow up to that, quality control on the pressure curves for the buildups for these tests. Did you make any, okay.
No, because we don't have access to them. I don't see, maybe 1 out of 1,000 I actually see a buildup curve in a well file.
Yeah, when you were, as far as your ranking and grading of the DSTs, was there any consideration given to the length of the test with the opens and shut-ins?
No, they were all considered. Because that's another thing. We really have limited information. Sometimes they don't show a start and end time. We just see results, you know. Thank you, guys.
So this is, since this is a geology session, something already went wrong. So, and we're also very used to dealing with this. So, Alec's, Pollard's presentation is still being downloaded. Turns out it's very large. So we're moving that back. That'll maybe be the last session or the last talk in the second part of this session. We've moved Tim Nesheim up. Tim is head of the subsurface section for the Geological Survey, and his presentation is review of hydrocarbon charge and production from the middle and lower Three Forks formations, second, third benches. So I appreciate Tim being flexible and coming right up here. No. Maybe a couple minutes.
Couple minutes?
One thing also just to mention is somebody took the pointer, that's why it's not here. Ryan Rauschenberger and Jody Smith are the two that we're looking at, so
All right, well, that's going to throw off my presentation maybe a little bit. I think with every good geology presentation, it's really about telling a story. And the titles of stories really have 2 points, and that's one, to kind of draw in like a reader or listenership, and you guys are already here. The second purpose is probably to talk about that story later on, and I really don't expect any of you to share my title again. You know, it's not like at the mixer tonight you can be like, well, did you see that presentation on the examination of downward hydrocarbon charge within the Bakken Three Forks petroleum system? No, you're going to say, hey, did you see that youngish guy talk about oil in the Three Forks? That's about it. So we're going to talk about oil in the Three Forks today. Kind of giving a little bit of an overview. We're at the Bakken Three Forks Petroleum Conference. Most of you probably have an understanding of this, but you know, between these two units, they produce throughout North Dakota, Montana, as well as Saskatchewan and Manitoba. North Dakota is kind of the heart of the Bakken Three Forks production. As you can kind of see the map on the left, it's regional. The black dots are your Bakken producing, Three Forks producing wells. In North Dakota, we've had somewhere over 15,000 horizontal wells drilled and completed in the units. I think actively it's somewhere over 13,000 wells are currently producing. We have some that are inactive, and we also have our DUCs that are sitting out there. Cumulative production through the end of 2019 was somewhere over 3.3 billion barrels of oil, so we're about to climb past that first USGS assessment. And presently we're back up over about 1 million barrels of oil production per day around, and 2.8 billion cubic feet of gas as well. I don't know if we're going to get up to that 2 million barrels of oil production per day that the governor was hoping for in the past, just off the Bakken Three Forks, but maybe some of those other units that Travis was touching on are going to get us there somewhere in the future. So when you look back in the Bakken Three Forks, it didn't all happen just at once. And so there were kind of phases of development, of exploration, looking at different units, different zones. Looking at what hasn't really worked commercially yet. There have been several horizontal test wells drilled and completed in the Basal Lodgepole Formation, most of which produced and sold some amounts of oil, but not enough to warrant development. And there's even been a couple wells drilled in the Basal Three Forks the industry refers to as the fourth bench. And those wells also produce some oil, but not enough to warrant development, at least to date. And so there's kind of 4 reservoir targets, even 5, actually, when I was thinking about this last night. There's the pronghorn member down in the Dickinson area, but that's a little bit more discontinuous, so I probably should have it there on there. But there's 4 reservoirs shown on this slide, so that's reality what we're talking about right now. And the Middle Bakken was your first primary exploration and development target. I know there were some upper shale wells back in the late 80s, early 90s, and even early on in this, the operators were drilling and completing in the shales some with fracking and got some production. But in terms of actually development, the Middle Bakken was your first jewel. And that's kind of what started off in Elm Coulee when that was discovered in kind of the late 1990s or 2000s. And then when Partial was discovered in eastern North Dakota, again, it was the Middle Bakken. And then the initial phase of infill exploration development, it was Middle Bakken. And then came along the Upper Three Forks. And this maybe sets me up for this whole presentation, but initially it was proposed that the Upper Three Forks was another viable reservoir. And so before my time with the survey in the late 2000s, there was a workshop on the Three Forks Formation when it was currently in that prospective phase. And there was a geologist there that was fairly well known leading the workshop on the Three Forks Formation. And at one point towards the end, I believe, this semi-prominent geologist that was the Three Forks expert in North Dakota told everybody in the audience, "I've never seen oil in the Three Forks." I'm sure a few people in the audience probably gasped because they knew there was some. A few years later, the Upper Three Forks developed into a prominent target. I mean, gosh, there's thousands of wells in it in North Dakota, on its way to tens of thousands. And afterwards, that geologist was asked again, "Hey, I thought you said there was no oil in the Three Forks." And his reply was, "Well, I never looked for oil in the Three Forks." Get back to that in a second. Early 2010s, led by Continental Resources, they started touting this idea that there were reservoirs in the Middle and Lower Three Forks. And then they threw out this bench terminology, which we're still trying to sort through a little bit. But I mean, every resource play, I think, now has benches, whether you're in the Niobrara, you're the Wolf Camp, and I'm sure the Eagleford probably has benches too, you know. And so they talked about the first bench being at the top, the second, third, and fourth. And there was a lot of skepticism early on that there's no oil in the middle and lower Three Forks. And of course, there were some cores that showed there wasn't much oil in some areas in the basin. But then there was a USGS assessment that was coming up, the third one. And I was told, hey, Tim, you got to look into reasons for another assessment. And so I was like, I should probably look into those other benches, the middle and lower Three Forks. And so I thought, probably the best way to start looking at those is just to look for oil, so that at the end of the day, I can tell you I looked for oil in the middle and lower Three Forks before I say anything else. So it's not like I can go and look at it myself, but we have cores and core analysis data. So when operators cut a core sample and they extract it, they take these mini cores, which you can kind of see in the top center part of the screen, and they take a mini core called a core plug. And from that core plug, they measure the amount of pore space that's in between the mineral grains, and they measure the types of fluid that are filling those pore spaces. And then volumetrically, you can calculate how much oil and water there is. The thing to keep in mind with these fluid saturations is that they are minimum values. Because it's core, initially it's thousands of feet below the surface. It's sitting in this continuous rock layer. And so as soon as they cut the core, you're removing it from its host rock layer. And then you're pulling it up thousands of feet, and you're depressurizing it, going from thousands of PSI pressure up to atmospheric pressure. And as soon as that core gets to the surface, you're going to be leaking and evaporating fluids, gases, and some cores are handled a little bit better. They put wax on the outside of the core, and we even still have some core pieces in our core library that have wax around them. I'm sure those help. And so some cores are handled a little bit better before they analyze for the fluids and the pore space, and they're analyzed quicker. And then I'm sure there's the other cores that they get pulled out of the ground, and they just kind of sit around on the well site, or they get sent into the lab, and they sit on the lab's shelf for months, maybe over a year. For a while, it took like over a year to get your cores analyzed at Weatherford and Core Labs unless you wanted to pay a premium. And so you always look at these fluids as minimum values. Some people may ask, well, they're drilling with oil-based mud. Couldn't you get, some contamination, the drilling fluids getting in there? And that does happen. You can get oil-based drill muds that'll force their way into cores and oil stain it and fill up the pore space with some oil, but that's probably more conventional reservoirs. With the Bakken Three Forks, the reason this play works is the oil isn't going anywhere because it's so tight, so low permeability. And so when you're drilling with oil-based mud, it's really not going to force its way very far into the core because it's just a low perm system. And so when I see oil saturations in the Three Forks, by golly, I bet that's oil. Granted, what kind of oil? You have your asphaltenes and your resins, that's not coming out. And then you have your aromatics, or your producible oils. Now, I think I understand those terms, but I'm not an expert on the different types of oil. But some of it's producible, some of it's not. And these oil analyses, I think, kind of mix it all together. And so on the left is my map of my study area, western North Dakota, and those green circles are partial to complete cores of the Three Forks Formation, where I compiled and evaluated these core analyses from the Three Forks. Bottom right corner, that's a cross-section. Green is the gamma ray log where I did my Y-line log correlations. And then black is your oil saturations from the core, blue is your water, and that white space in between is the void space that was filled with something. And we'll get back to that later too. And before I go into my oil saturation mapping, one unit that came up to be important when you're looking at oil in the Three Forks is this pronghorn member. The pronghorn down in the Dickinson area becomes this porous, permeable reservoir, and it's a viable resource. It's a viable reservoir to target down in the Dickinson area. In our area of study, it's more discontinuous, and it's also more clay-rich mudstone. It's a relatively poor quality reservoir, poor quality source rock typically. And it separates the lower Bakken shale from the underlying Three Forks. And the lower shale is likely your oil-generating source rock that's sourcing it. We'll touch on that again later too. But this pronghorn member, there's this thick trend you can see that goes down through McKinsey County on the bottom left-hand side of the left-hand side map. And as that pronghorn thickens, the lower Bakken shale thins, and it separates from the Three Forks. And so I'll show that pronghorn thick trend on a number of my Three Forks maps. And so now we're going to look at oil in the Three Forks, going unit by unit. And so first off, looking at the upper Three Forks. And so on the right, I have my cross-section that goes from the southwest to the northeast. And if you look on the outer wells, there's some black, there's some oil saturation, but it's mostly water. And as you move towards the central wells, you start to see more oil saturations and less water. And if you look at my map, it's kind of a bullseye, and it's still not a perfect map. I think I actually should add a higher oil saturation up in Divide County in the Ambrose Field area. But big picture here. But the darker green area in the middle represents where you have more oil and less water in the core analyses. And there are some exceptions because these are minimum values. Sometimes you might only have 10% oil saturation on average, but the water is averaging 30%. And so you get a lot of oil in that dark green area, and as you move out, you're getting less oil, more water. And if you notice that pronghorn thick trend, you actually can't see it because it's a white line. But right towards the southwest, as you're going from medium green to light green, that's where the pronghorn thick trend, suddenly the oil saturation of the Three Forks drop off pretty quick. And then in your outer corners of the study area, to the south and to the northeast, core analysis data has negligible oil and just very high water. And so it forms a bullseye. Moving into the middle Three Forks, the second bench, it's a similar picture, but a little more irregular and a little bit smaller. And so again, there's that central area where if you look at the cross-section, you have really good oil saturations. Where if you look at the middle Three Forks and the upper Three Forks, they're almost indistinguishable from one another just on glancing, even though the upper Three Forks still will average a little bit higher oil. And so you have that darker green area in the middle part of the study area on the left. That's where the middle Three Forks has its highest oil and lowest water saturations. Then you move beyond that, you get in that light green area with the dotted outline, and that's where you have a little bit higher water, but you still have some notable oil saturations averaging 10 to 30% on the core analyses. And then beyond that, you get to where there's minimal oil. And you can see that pronghorn thick trend to the southwest. That's where the oil saturations seem to drop off. But there are some exceptions. Locally, the pronghorn may be a source rock, but that's a talk for another day. Moving down into the lower Three Forks, I don't have as much core control into this unit, as you can see from my cross-section. The well on the far right has a few core analyses in the top of the lower Three Forks that's all water. And then in the middle area, there's that well in kind of the middle right, a little bit of oil, but mostly water. Then there's that well on the left, the 21706. That well has 15 to 20% oil saturations or so through the lower Three Forks. That's oil that's going hundreds of feet below the base of the Bakken Formation. It's not as much, it's a lower oil saturation than the upper Three Forks, but it's oil. And so that green area is where you have kind of these intermediate oil saturations across the lower Three Forks. They never reach the same levels or the same averages as the middle and upper Three Forks, but the lower Three Forks has some oil in it. And again, as you move into that pronghorn thick trend, the oil saturation seemed to drop off. And then as you move in kind of the outer white area, there's minimal oil in the lower Three Forks. So it's not going to be any kind of continuous resource play out there. You could still have some lateral migration. Bakken Three Forks in general, as you move north, permeability and porosity pick up to where you start to see lateral migration in these units. That's why Manitoba has oil in Bakken Three Forks production. But in the middle part of the basin, it's pretty low perm. And so I took these three maps from the upper, middle, and lower Three Forks, and I kind of combined them together into that central map that I'll bring back later, where there's that central darkest green area, and that's where the upper and middle Three Forks have those higher oil saturations, lower Three Forks kind of intermediate. And then that lighter green, larger areas where the upper Three Forks has pretty good oil saturations, but the middle and lower, they're more intermediate. And then beyond that, it's just the upper Three Forks at best. And so there's oil in the Three Forks. There's some oil in the upper Three Forks, the middle, the lower. How did it get there? That's a good question. And so in this system, the idea is you have the upper and lower Bakken shale. They're organic rich. They're generating and expelling oil. And there have been some studies that have taken oil samples from the shales and compared it with oil samples produced from the middle Bakken and the upper Three Forks, and they've geochemically linked them. So you can say with pretty good confidence the Bakken Shales have sourced the Middle Bakken and the Upper Three Forks. But to my understanding, there hasn't been any published literature that links Bakken shale oil with the Middle and Lower Three Forks. It's a public literature. But that's a presumed source rock. Other alternatives, well, is this Three Forks itself self-sourced? No. The Three Forks does not have any source rock. It doesn't have any organic rich muds that are generating and expelling oil. I've looked at a lot of Three Forks cores, and I've looked for source rocks. And I've looked at analysis data for it, and there's nothing there. You step down into the Bird Bear, it's underneath it. Francis will talk about that a little bit later. The Bird Bear does have some thin, discontinuous, organic rich mudstone beds within it. And the Bird Bear is probably self-sourced. But if you look at the quantity and the distribution of source rock in the Bird Bear, it is not overwhelming. And also the upper part of the Bird Bear has these 3 to 4 regionally extensive anhydrite beds. And anhydrite, that blocks hydrocarbon migration. And so if you have so-so source rocks, really good hydrocarbon seals, that oil is not going up. The Bird Bear is highly unlikely to source the Three Forks. And so the only option really you have that seems legitimate for at least the vast majority of oil in the Three Forks is the Lower Bakken Shale. And so I thought I'd look at the lower shale in a few ways. And so the first approach I took was kind of broad brushstroke, thickness, thermal maturity. You know, that'll kind of give you an idea of where it's probably generating, expelling its most oil. There is some variance in the total organic carbon content, the organic richness of the shales, but relatively speaking, it's not a lot of variability in western North Dakota. They seem to vary more as you move to the east. And if I was, being exact in my calculations, I would want to factor that in. But so I looked at thickness and thermal maturity. And so on the left is an isopac thickness map of the lower shale, where it ranges from being absent in the bottom southern corners of the study area to locally reaching thicknesses of 50, even touching 60 feet thick towards the central portions of our study area. And then again, where you see that pronghorn thick trend to the southwest, the lower shale thins over that thick trend. And so it varies quite a bit in thickness. Thermal maturity, typical thermal maturity used to evaluate the shale, I think you could use bitumen reflectance, but there's no vitrinite in the Bakken. So you can't do vitrinite reflectance. But standard, we have a lot of Tmax data and hydrogen index data at the state level. And so I went through and I took hydrogen index and Tmax for dozens of lower Three Forks cores, and I averaged those two values together. For those of you not familiar, Tmax, it's basically the level of thermal maturity. It's the highest temperature based on calculations that the shale has gotten to, even though it's kind of a relative temperature. Steve Norden could tell you more about that. Ask him questions at the end of the day. But the higher the Tmax, the more mature a source rock is with generating and expelling hydrocarbons. Hydrogen index is kind of the inverse. It is the oil generation potential of the organic carbon in that source rock. And so if the source rock is immature, it's got its highest potential for oil generation. But as that source rock becomes mature and generates oil and gas, it loses its remaining generation potential. So hydrogen index will decrease as it thermally matures. And so that plot on the left is plotting average Tmax versus average hydrogen index, or HI, for individual core sets. And you can see when Tmax is high or low, hydrogen index is relatively high. And then as Tmax increases, hydrogen index decreases. You'll notice there's red symbols versus green symbols. The green symbols are more recent data sets, probably taken within the last 20 years or so. The red symbols are analyses that were back in, I think, like the 90s, the 80s, taken with older instrumentation, where the Tmax values just seem to be lower. And so if you were to plot up Tmax with the older data and the newer data, it's just a lot more irregular. But when you combine hydrogen index with the two, they plot a lot more smoother together. And so when I made my thermal maturity map on the right, I just used hydrogen index averages. Still not perfect, because I'm sure hydrogen index originally varied some in the shales, but again, we're broad brush stroke. So in the blue areas and a little bit of the purple, that's where the lower shale is at its lowest levels of maturity, where it's generating its least to negligible amounts of oil and gas. And then as you move towards the red colored areas, the red is where it's at its deepest depths, highest temperatures, and it's generating its highest percentage of oil and gas. And then the other colors are kind of intermediate. And so to kind of get a picture of where the lower shale is generating and expelling its most oil, you combine thickness and thermal maturity, assuming the original organic richness was somewhat similar across this area. And so I use cutoffs of a HI of 400 and 200, and then a lower shale thickness of about 20 feet. And that just kind of seemed to work with the other maps. And so that central map is kind of a snapshot picture of thickness, thermal maturity of the lower shale. Red and yellow, or green and yellow is where it has its thickness and highest maturity. It's generating and expelling its highest volumes of oil per unit area. The red is where the lower shale is still 20 feet thick or so, but it's more intermediate levels of thermal maturity. And so if you take that lower shale map, overlay it with my generalized oil saturation map for the Three Forks, you'll see that highest area of oil saturation is through the middle and upper Three Forks, overlaps with where the lower shale is at its thickest, most thermally mature. And then as you move into kind of the intermediate oil saturation area for the middle and lower Three Forks, that's where the lower shale is still thick and at kind of intermediate levels of thermal maturity, relatively speaking. And so to get oil into the middle and lower Three Forks, part of the equation is simply having more oil and gas generation and expulsion from the lower shale. It's still not a perfect picture. Geology is never perfect. And plus, these are two different data sets that you're kind of merging together. And there's probably other factors that come into it, like the geology, lithofacies changes, and as well as structure. But they kind of fit together. So that sounds good, Tim. You made some neat maps. There's some regional trends, but volumetrically, how does it work? You know, has the lower shale potentially generated and expelled enough oil to account for what you're seeing in the Three Forks? So again, I go back to the core analysis data. And for the lower shale, I calculated how much oil it's generated potentially using previously developed equations, developed by like Dan Jarvie and this other guy, Schmoker, from the 90s. And so equations 1 to 3, not going to talk to them too much, but basically with my oil generation and expulsion calculations, I had a minimum value calculated assuming an original hydrogen index of 500. And I had a maximum of 650 HI. Because if you look at immature lower Bakken shale cores, that's kind of the range. They range from about 500, maybe a little bit less sometimes, to upwards of 650 on average. So it seems like a good range. And I also calculated the original oil in place of the lower shale, because you can calculate how much oil it's generated, but it's going to hold on to some of that oil. And so I used the core analyses with the OOIP calculation, equation 4 on the bottom left, to calculate how much is holding, subtract that from what it's generated, and that's its expulsion value. And then I also went in and calculated how much oil was in the Three Forks, going through the different subintervals. And again, I used that same equation with the core analyses, and I had minimum and maximum calculations, because there's that void space. You know, that void space was maybe filled with oil, water, a little bit of both. And so I had a minimum value, always assuming that all the void space was filled with water, a maximum assuming 100% oil. And the truth is probably somewhere in between. And so I have these charts and plots and other things that I could talk to, but at the end of the day, if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, if you look at the average of the averages for how much oil the lower shale has generated and expelled from 4 separate cores in the core part of the study area, my estimation is that the lower shale has generally generated and expelled about 29 million barrels of oil per section. And if you look at the core analyses for the whole Three Forks section for 4 separate cores, the average OOIP of the whole Three Forks is about 14.5 million barrels of oil per section. So the lower shale seems to have potentially generated and expelled more than enough oil to account for what's in the Three Forks, which is how it should be, because some of that oil probably went up into the middle Bakken. So volumetrically, this could work. I could still be wrong here, but it's always good to have equations. Steve taught me that. Then there's less questions when there's equations. So what about production? And so something I kind of added in here, I've given this talk, I think this is 3rd or 4th time I've given a version of this talk. On the left side is a bubble map showing these 700-day oil cumes from 250 plus middle Three Forks wells have been drilled and completed. So those largest, greenest circles have cumed over 300,000 barrels of oil from a middle Three Forks completion. And then as you get the less green, smaller circles, their cumes are dropping to eventually where some have barely produced any oil. And as you move to that center map, you'll notice there's the underlying colors. Well, I went in and calculated water cut off of production from those wells. And I usually dropped off the first few months of production because that's when your frac fluid is flowing back. Although sometimes with middle Three Forks completions, the water cut increases instead of decreasing in a few of them. It's odd. I'd like to talk to an engineer about that. How do you inject a whole bunch of fluid into a unit and then your water cut doesn't jump up initially? But I don't know. I'm not a frac engineer. But in any case, but I was usually looking for stabilized water cuts because some wells never really reached a stabilized water cut for a variety of reasons, perhaps. But basically, in that middle map, those blue areas on the outer parts, that's where the water cut is over 70% and the oil cut is less than 30%. And as you move into the red areas, that's in the red, that's where you're getting over 50% oil and less than 50% water. And then the orange area is kind of intermediate. And you can see a lot of those big, best producing middle Three Forks wells are right in and around where you have the lowest water cut and the highest oil cut from this unit. And so the two trend together, but not perfectly. And if you plot the bubbles in the water cut map, you can see again with that shale overlay, that thicker dashed line on the right is where the lower Bakken shale is at its 20 feet or more thickness and its highest levels of maturity. And so again, your best producing wells from the middle Three Forks, the second bench, your lowest water cut, highest oil cut, kind of overlaps with where the lower shale is at its thickest, most thermally mature. But there is still a lot of variability in there. So this doesn't solve all the answers. And then there's that little pocket of production down in northwestern Dunn County that people like to point at and say, see, Tim, you're wrong. I am on something. You know, all ideas or concepts or models are wrong, but are they useful? Hopefully this is a little bit useful. So down along that little pocket of production in Dunn County, my thought is maybe there is extra structural fracture networks that you have a little bit of migration coming along, kind of the Neset and Little Knife trend. Or something else, I can't figure out all the answers, or none of them at all. I think I give more questions than answers in this maybe. When you move into the lower Three Forks, the third bench, it's a similar picture, but we just have less data, and also the water cuts are higher. Surprise, surprise, you're getting further away from the source. But on the left, you have 40 some odd wells that have 700-day oil cumes for the lower Three Forks. And there's only one well up in like southwestern Montreal County that cumed over 300,000 barrels of oil from the third bench, the lower Three Forks. And then you have pockets of production otherwise. Some of these completions are commercial at various price points. But one thing to mention, in the middle Three Forks, the second bench, there's been somewhere around 300 wells drilled and completed in the second bench, the middle Three Forks. Somewhere on the order of 70 to 80% of those wells were drilled and completed after 2014. So the middle Three Forks is getting drilled and developed in a price point range of $50 to $60 oil. When you go to the third bench, the lower Three Forks, there's probably on the order of 90 to 95% of those wells were drilled and completed in 2014 or before, within a price point of probably more like $70 to $80 oil. There were a few lower Three Forks wells drilled and completed, I think, in like 2017, 2018. One company drilled a few. They were better than the previous ones, but it seems like the lower Three Fork is not as productive. It also has higher oil cuts. So it's almost like my oil saturations, water cut production from the upper, middle, and lower Three Forks, it decreases as you go down, both the quality, the distribution. So as you get further away from the lower shale, you're just getting less oil production on the various Three Forks horizons. And so that's kind of my conclusions. So kind of main conclusion is that like the thickness, thermal maturity of the lower Bakken shale trends with oil saturations, the various Three Forks horizons. And that pronghorn member that through McKenzie County, that thick trend seems to have a negative effect on oil saturations and production across the Three Forks formation. And there's some other conclusions in there too, but hopefully you get the general sense of it. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions, and thank you for your time and attention.
All right, we'll be taking some questions.
Thank you, team, for this great presentation. I have just a question regarding your logs about oil potential in Three Forks. As to the best of my knowledge, Three Forks is team-bedded formation.
Is a what formation?
Team beds. I'm talking about.
Oh, thin beds?
Yeah, team-bedded formation. So in your logs, did you use some advanced technique like TBA, team bed analysis, or just the conventional logs? Because I believe that conventional, it doesn't capture the anisotropy of the team beds.
Yeah, so, I don't know, yeah. So with all my oil saturation data, it was just all from core plugs. I have been tinkering with using wireline logs, if that's kind of what you're getting at, to calculate oil saturations using wireline logs, because then I could go from having dozens of core control points to having hundreds if I use wireline log calculations. But I haven't gotten to that point. And that is something like when you get into the Three Forks formation, it is relatively thin bed. And for those of you that have time, interest, and attention, I have a virtual core workshop presentation that's a short hour-and-a-half long that looks at the stratigraphy and facies architecture of the middle Three Forks, kind of showing how the reservoir facies of the second bench, the middle Three Forks, changes laterally, and it changes quite a bit. And so, when you're looking at these units, I kind of mentioned there's more than just lower shale thickness thermal maturity. There's also a function of reservoir quality. And so there's some areas where the upper Three Forks and middle Three Forks and probably lower Three Forks are better quality reservoirs, better able to take on hydrocarbon charge and produce hydrocarbons, and other areas where they're lower quality. And I think that's why you see some of that high variability of second bench, middle Three Forks production in that core acreage, is just some places it's a better reservoir. And then I think also structure is also plays a role. So I don't know if that kind of answers a little bit. There's more work to be done, if you need to switch your dissertation project, I think because you're PhD, right? No, you're good. So.
Thank you, Tim. Great talk. I just had more of a comment. So on your bubble maps, you talked about how there's still not a lot of consistency with some of those bubbles. And one suggestion, if you haven't already done so, is to break the wells out into the year that they were completed, because you do get an increase in fluids production with wells that were completed more recently. So maybe, if you haven't already done that, maybe...
I did tinker with that, and if I would have read my exact slide notes, I probably would have had that comment.
Okay.
But when I kind of wung it a little bit more today. So, but yeah, I was going to say, if you did look at middle Three Forks wells in that core acreage, some of those poor producers are actually shorter laterals, and so you could throw those out. And then there is also a greater return as you look at newer wells. The newer completions produce better, but it is more than that. And I did piece that together and tinker with it, and probably could talk about that maybe sometime in the future, or somebody else will, So, but I did notice some variation in that the newer wells produce better. But it also comes back, I don't know, water cut is some of it too, anyways, but yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Do we have any other questions? Back here? Well, I guess if there's no other questions, we will be taking about a half-hour break until 3 o'clock with our second session. So we will see everybody back then.